There is a man named Len Lomell. He was a sergeant from New Jersey, not a general, not a decorated officer with his face on a magazine cover. Just a sergeant, a kid from a small town who ended up standing in a French apple orchard on the morning of June 6th, 1944, holding a grenade. What he did in that orchard may have saved D-Day. Not the generals, not the battleships, not the 1,000-plane bombing runs. A sergeant, with a grenade, alone. He never talked about it. 4 years, decades, when people push him to tell the story, he shut it down with one sentence. Boys died that day. That's all I can tell you. But to understand what Len Lomell did in that orchard, and why he did it, you first need to meet the man who put him on that cliff. His name was James Rudder. He was 34 years old, a rancher's son from Eden, Texas, a football coach. And if you have never heard his name, that is exactly the problem this video is here to fix. James Earl Rudder did not look like a man who belonged at the center of the most important day of the Second World War. He was born in 1910 in Eden, Texas, a town so small that the main occupation was surviving the land. His father raised cattle. James played football. He coached football. He built a quiet life, a wife, children, a job, a future that had nothing to do with the beaches of France. Then came December of 1941. Pearl Harbor, and the United States, in a single morning, found itself at war with Germany and Japan simultaneously. Rudder had been commissioned as a reserve officer years earlier. It was mostly ceremonial, a piece of paper that had been gathering dust. Now it was a summons. He reported for active duty. What the Army discovered almost immediately was that James Rudder had a gift that no amount of training could manufacture. He could look men in the eyes, exhausted men, frightened men, men who had convinced themselves they couldn't do something, and make them believe otherwise. By 1944, he commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion. 225 soldiers, hand-selected, trained for the kind of missions that other units weren't asked to consider. The kind where the casualty estimates were so high that the phrase acceptable losses appeared in the planning documents. The mission they were given in the spring of 1944 was this. At a place called Pointe du Hoc, a craggy granite headland on the coast of Normandy, the Germans had positioned 6 155mm artillery guns inside reinforced concrete bunkers. Each gun could fire a shell 14 miles. They were aimed at the beaches where the Allied invasion would land. If those guns were operational on D-Day, the soldiers coming ashore at Omaha and Utah Beach wouldn't be walking into a difficult fight. They'd be walking into a slaughter. The Rangers' job was to climb the cliff and destroy the guns. The cliff was 100 feet of sheer rock. The casualty estimate for the climb alone, before they even reached the top, was 50%. Allied planners called that acceptable. Before they shipped out, a senior commander pulled Rudder aside, told him he was too valuable to risk, that his role was to command, not to climb, that the mission needed him alive. Rudder heard every word. Then he looked at the men getting into those boats. He had to choose his rank or his men. I'm going with them. That was the end of the conversation. And in a few hours, that decision would cost him more than he expected and matter more than he could have known. To understand what happened next, you need to picture Pointe du Hoc. It is a promontory, a pointed slab of limestone and granite jutting out into the English Channel, exactly halfway between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. The cliffs drop straight down into the water. At the top, barbed wire observation towers, machine gun emplacements, and, at the center of it all, 6 guns in hardened concrete, surrounded by a garrison of German soldiers whose entire job was to make sure no one got near them. The Allies had been bombing the place for weeks. Hundreds of sorties, thousands of tons of ordnance. The top of Pointe du Hoc had been turned into a cratered wasteland. Churned earth, broken concrete, chunks of rock the size of cars thrown in every direction. What the bombing also did, without anyone intending it, was give the German defenders something they hadn't had before: natural cover. The shell craters were perfect foxholes. The broken bunkers were perfect firing positions. The Rangers would be climbing into a fortress that had been pre-excavated for its defenders. But there was something else, something none of the Allied planners knew. Something that had happened weeks before D-Day, quietly, without any signal intercept or aerial reconnaissance picking it up. The Germans had moved the guns. The German commanders, worried about exactly the kind of attack that was coming, had relocated all 6 155mm guns inland, transported them under cover of darkness, hidden them under camouflage netting in an apple orchard nearly a mile from the cliff's edge. The concrete bunkers at Pointe du Hoc were empty. The guns the Rangers were being sent to destroy were no longer there. And on the night of June 5th, 1944, as 225 men climbed into their landing craft in the darkness and headed toward the coast of France, not one of them knew. Then something happened no one expected. They were late. The plan called for the Rangers to reach the base of the cliff at 6:30 in the morning. A navigational error pushed the landing craft off course. By the time the mistake was caught and corrected, it was nearly 7 o'clock. The German garrison had been at their positions for 40 minutes, fully armed, fully alert, waiting for exactly what was coming. The ramps dropped. The Rangers moved. They carried grappling hooks attached to ropes, some fired from rocket launchers mounted on the landing craft, some thrown by hand. The ropes had spent the night in seawater. They were heavier than they'd been in training. Some of the rocket-fired hooks couldn't clear the cliff edge. The ones that did, the Germans cut them. Men fell. More hooks went up. More ropes caught. And the Rangers began to climb, hand over hand up 100 feet of wet rock, with machine gun fire coming from above, grenades dropping past their heads, and the sound of men falling into the water below. Rudder was at the base of the cliff, directing the assault, calling up to his men, when a German bullet hit him in the leg. He could have stopped. The wound was legitimate. No one would have argued. He didn't stop. He grabbed the rope and started climbing. By 7:08 in the morning, the first Rangers reached the top. They came over the edge into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Craters, rubble, smoke, and German soldiers who had been waiting for them. The fighting at the top of the cliff was not tactical. It was immediate and violent and close. Men grappling in shell holes. Rifles used as clubs. Combat stripped down to its most brutal form. And then, through the smoke, fighting their way across the cliff top, the first Rangers reached the gun emplacements. They stopped. The bunkers were empty. The guns are gone. Every man who died getting up that cliff. Every rope that was cut. Every body still hanging in the water below. The target wasn't there. For a moment, just a moment, no one knew what to do. Rudder didn't panic. He ordered the Rangers to hold the cliff top and establish a perimeter. He sent the coded signal to the fleet. He was already trying to figure out what had happened to the guns. The Rangers spread across the bombed-out plateau, pushing back German counterattacks, searching every bunker, every trench. Nothing. And then, without anyone ordering it, without a plan, without a radio call, without permission, 2 men decided to go further. Sergeant Len Lomell and Sergeant Jack Kuhn moved inland. They were working through the fields beyond the clifftop perimeter when Lomell noticed something in the mud beneath his boots. Tire tracks, not old ones, fresh, wide and deep, the kind left by something very heavy, moved recently, maybe within the past day or two. Lomell studied the tracks. He looked at Kuhn. They both understood what tracks like that meant. They had a choice. Following those tracks meant moving deeper into enemy territory. Alone, without orders, without any backup. If they encountered a German patrol, if anything went wrong, no one knew where they were. 2 men, no one watching, no one to give them permission or tell them to stop. They followed the tracks. The tracks led through hedgerows and open fields and into an apple orchard roughly a mile from the cliff. And Lomell stopped. There they were, 555mm guns. Enormous gray-green machines, their barrels pointing toward Utah Beach. Ammunition stacked beside them, ready to fire, hidden under camouflage netting from the air. And not a single German soldier guarding them. Lomell pulled out his thermite grenades. He moved to the first gun, opened the traversing mechanism that allows the barrel to aim and swivel, and place a grenade inside it. Pulled the pin, moved to the second gun, did the same. 2 guns destroyed. Their aiming mechanisms burned to slag. He was out of grenades. He turned to Kuhn, told him to stay, to watch, to signal if anyone came. Then Lomell ran, back through the hedgerows, back toward the ranger perimeter to find more grenades. He borrowed them from other rangers without explaining why. He didn't have time to explain. He ran back to the orchard. For several minutes, Jack Kuhn stood alone in that orchard. One American sergeant, standing between those 5 guns and every soldier on the beach below. Lomell came back. They destroyed the remaining guns. The same way, thermite traversing mechanisms fire. No orders, no audience, no one watching. Then something moved in the hedgerow at the far end of the orchard. German soldiers, drawn by the sound of the demolition, moving toward the orchard. Lomell and Kuhn slipped into the hedgerow and were gone before the Germans reached the guns. The 155mm of Pointe du Hoc did not fire a single round on D-Day. Not one shell. Not one. 2 men from New Jersey. That's the math. Back on the cliff, Rudder had no way to know what Lomell and Kuhn had just done. He was managing a deteriorating situation with the information he had. His signal, praise the Lord, had gone out to the fleet. Mission accomplished. Rangers holding the point. Relief was supposed to arrive by 9 in the morning. 9 came and went. 10, 11, noon. No one came. What Rudder didn't know, what none of the men on that cliff could see, was that Omaha Beach was a catastrophe of historic proportions. The first waves of American soldiers had been destroyed in the water. Some companies had lost 90% of their men before reaching the sand. The relief force that was supposed to link up with the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had ceased to exist as a fighting unit before it ever left the beach. The Rangers were alone, and the Germans knew it. By early afternoon, the German commanders had confirmed what their patrols were reporting. The force holding the cliff top was small, isolated, and cut off. No reinforcements were coming. Whatever ammunition the Americans had brought up with them was all they were going to get. The counterattacks began in earnest, wave after wave through the afternoon, into the evening, into the night. The Rangers fought with what they had, and when what they had ran out, they fought with what they could take from the Germans they killed. Captured rifles, captured grenades. By the second day, some Rangers were firing German weapons because their own were empty. Rudder, leg wound untreated, running on no sleep, directed the defense from a bombed-out bunker at the edge of the cliff. His command post took 2 direct hits. A German shell landed close enough to knock him sideways. His radio operator was killed mid-transmission. The man's blood was on the handset. Rudder wiped it off and kept transmitting. By midnight on June 6th, some Rangers had been awake for over 30 hours. The Germans kept coming. June 7th arrived, 24 hours since the first boots hit the beach. Rudder now had fewer than 90 men fit for combat. Of 225 who had climbed the cliff, no sleep, no food that mattered, near the end of their ammunition, surrounded on 3 sides. A supply drop came in sometime during the night of June 7th. Blankets, rations, It landed in no man's land, between the Ranger perimeter and the German line. Nobody wanted to get it. The Rangers stayed in their holes and kept fighting. Rudder could have order retreat. He had the authority. He had the justification. Any military calculus in the world would have supported pulling back to the cliff's edge and holding there. He made a different decision. He didn't move. The perimeter held. A patch of cratered French rock roughly the size of 2 football fields. 90 men, running on nothing. 36 hours in. 38. 40. June 8th, 1944. Approximately 11 o'clock in the morning. 40 hours after the first Ranger crested the cliff at Pointe du Hoc, an American relief column from Omaha Beach broke through the German lines and reached the Ranger perimeter. What the relief soldiers found when they got there was not what any of them had expected. 90 men, still in their positions, still facing outward, hollow-eyed, filthy, some wrapped in pieces of German clothing because their own had been shredded by shrapnel, some carrying rifles that didn't belong to any American unit. They had not retreated a single step. An officer from the relief column walked up to Rudder and asked how many men he had. Rudder looked at him for a moment. Enough. That was all he said. The final tally, of 225 Rangers who climbed the cliff at Pointe du Hoc on June 6th, 135 were killed or wounded by the time relief arrived on June 8th. More than half the men who went up that cliff didn't come back down. And the mission, the original mission, the reason the entire operation existed, had been completed not by the battalion, not by the plan, not by the commanding officers, but by 2 sergeants who followed tire tracks into an apple orchard and made a decision no one had ordered them to make. When Lomell was later asked what he felt in that moment, standing in the orchard, the last gun destroyed, the burning smell of thermite in the air, he was quiet for a long time before he answered. Nothing, he said. I just wanted to get back to the boys. James Rudder came home from the war. He went back to Texas. He became an administrator, eventually president of Texas A&M University. He hired faculty, built dormitories, expanded the athletic program, attended graduation ceremonies. Students who passed him in the hallways had no idea what he had done. He almost never told them. When veterans groups asked him to speak about D-Day, he was polite and brief. He did not write a memoir. He did not consult on films. He did not seek out reporters. He was James Rudder, university president, and whatever else he had been, he kept largely to himself. He died in 1970. He was 59 years old. Len Lomell became a lawyer in Toms River, New Jersey. He built a practice. He had a family. When journalists called, and eventually they did call, he declined most of the interviews. The ones he gave were brief. For the first 40 years after D-Day, most Americans couldn't tell you what Pointe du Hoc was. The story of the Rangers, the cliff, the guns, the 40-hour siege existed in military archives and unit histories and the memories of men who didn't talk about it. It was not part of the national memory of the war. Then, on June 6, 1984, 40 years to the day, President Ronald Reagan stood on that cliff in Normandy and gave a speech. The surviving Rangers were in the audience, old men in folding chairs on the very ground they had once refused to give up. Reagan spoke directly to them. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc, he said. These are the men who took the cliffs. Where do we find such men? It is considered one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century. And even after that, even after Reagan's words went around the world, most Americans still couldn't name a single Ranger who had been there. Still couldn't tell you who James Rudder was. Still couldn't tell you about a sergeant from New Jersey who walked into an orchard alone. After the speech, a journalist finally cornered Lomell, asked him directly, why had he never told his story publicly? Why had he stayed quiet for 40 years? Lomell thought about it. Then he said, because the boys who didn't make it back couldn't tell their stories. So I figured I shouldn't tell mine. That is what actual heroism looks like. Not the version in the movies, where the hero knows he's the hero, where the music swells, where everyone stops to watch the decisive moment. The real version looks like a man who believes his own survival disqualifies him from speaking, who measures his silence against the silence of the dead and decides they should go first. It looks like a football coach who climbed a cliff with a bullet in his leg and then spent the rest of his life quietly running a university, never once asking to be recognized for what he'd done. It looks like two sergeants in an apple orchard, alone, making a decision no one asked them to make, and then saying nothing about it for decades. A football coach from Texas, a sergeant from New Jersey. One refused to command from safety. One acted without being asked. Between them, climbing a cliff, holding a perimeter, walking into an orchard with a grenade, they gave D-Day a chance. 135 men died or bled on that rock. Their names are in the records. Most of them will never trend on social media. Most of them will never be the subject of a documentary. Most of them will be remembered, if they are remembered at all, only by the people who love them. Rudder and Lomell would have said, "That's right. Neither man wanted to be remembered, but history remembered them anyway." And if this story was new to you today, if you press play not knowing the name James Rudder or Len Lomell, then you understand exactly why we keep telling stories like this. Because Lomell was right. The boys who didn't make it back can't tell their stories. So we'll tell them for them. Share this video if it moved you. There are people in your life who need to hear this story, and they're probably not looking for it. That's why we're here. Estimated runtime, 24 to 27 minutes.